The lighthouse stood like a white sentinel against the gray morning sky, its beacon dormant now that dawn had broken over the Atlantic. Henry Whitmore climbed the spiral stairs of the lamp room, his weathered hands running along the familiar iron railing, his feet finding each step by memory after 37 years of the same routine. The lens needed cleaning, as it did every morning. Salt spray from the previous night's storm had left crystalline patterns across the glass, and Henry worked with practiced patience, polishing each surface until a great light shone clear and bright. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not urgency, and Henry had long ago settled into its rhythm. From the lamp room windows, he could see the rocky coastline stretching in both directions, dotted with tide pools that caught the morning light like scattered mirrors. The sea was calmer today than it had been during the storm, its surface rolling in long, lazy swells that caught the light and threw it back in dancing patterns. A few fishing boats moved slowly along the horizon, their engines too distant to hear over the constant whisper of waves against the rocks below. Henry had been a keeper of Beacon Point light since he was 28 years old, a young man still raw from grief over his wife's sudden illness, seeking solitude and purpose in equal measure. The lighthouse had provided both. The work was honest and necessary. Ships still relied on his beacon to navigate the treacherous rocks that lay hidden just beneath the surface during high tide. The isolation had been a blessing in those early years, giving him space to heal without well-meaning friends and relatives constantly reminding him of his loss. Now, at 65, Henry had grown into the solitude like a tree growing around a fence post. It had become part of his structure, inseparable from who he was. His days followed a comfortable pattern, maintaining the light, monitoring the weather, keeping detailed logs of vessels that passed, reading the books that arrived monthly with a supply delivery, tending the small garden he'd coaxed to life in the sheltered space behind the lighthouse keeper's cottage. The cottage sat at the base of the lighthouse, connected by a covered walkway that protected him from the worst weather. It was small but comfortable, with thick stone walls that kept the interior warm in winter and cool in summer. Henry had arranged it exactly to his liking over the decades. Books organized by subject on shelves he'd built himself, a reading chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, a kitchen table where he ate his meals while looking out at the sea. His few visitors were predictable and welcome. Coast Guard inspectors who came quarterly to ensure the light met regulations, the supply boat captain who brought provisions and mail monthly, and occasionally researchers or bird watchers who requested permission to study the seabirds that nested in the rocks during migration season. These interactions were pleasant but brief. Henry had learned to appreciate human contact in small, controlled doses. This particular morning began like any other. After cleaning the lens, Henry descended to the cottage and prepared his breakfast. Oatmeal with dried fruit, coffee strong enough to withstand the dampening effects of salt air. He ate while reading a book about maritime history, pausing occasionally to look up and watch the gulls diving for fish in the shallow water near the rocks. The mail boat wasn't due for another week, so Henry was surprised to see something unusual when he took his morning walk along the tide line. Among the typical debris that wash ashore after storms, seaweed, driftwood bleached white by sun and salt, the occasional lost fishing float, he spotted something that made him pause. A bottle, green glass made cloudy by its time in the sea, lay half buried in the sand and small stones. As Henry picked it up, he could see something inside, paper, rolled and secured with what looked like a piece of twine. The cork was still firmly in place, though softened by the water. Henry had found bottles on the beach before, but they were usually empty, discarded from passing ships or washed down from inland waterways during storms. This one was different. Someone had taken the time to seal a message inside, to send their words out into the uncertainty of the ocean currents, hoping they would find their way to someone who would read them. Back in the cottage, Henry set the bottle on his kitchen table and looked at it while he finished his morning coffee. The glass was thick and old-fashioned, the kind used for wine or spirits decades ago. The paper inside looked yellowed but intact. He found himself hesitant to open it, as if doing so would irrevocably change something about his carefully ordered world. But curiosity, dormant for years, began to stir. Henry found a corkscrew in the kitchen drawer, where he kept his few tools. The cork came out with a soft pop, releasing the faint scent of salt water and something else, maybe roses or lavender. Henry carefully extracted the paper, unrolling it gently to avoid tearing the edges. The message was written in careful handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. To whoever finds this message, my name is Eleanor Morrison, and I am writing this on my 80th birthday, November 15th, 1987. I live alone now in a house by the sea, and I wanted to send something beautiful into the world, even if I never know where it lands or who reads it. If you are reading this, please know that someone was thinking of you, hoping for your happiness, wishing you moments of peace and joy in whatever life you're living. The world can be lonely sometimes, but we are all connected by the same sky, the same ocean, the same hope for kindness. I am including pressed flowers for my garden, roses that bloomed late this year, as if they knew they might have one more chance to bring beauty into the world. May they bring you a moment of wonder wherever you are. Henry read the letter twice, then carefully unfolded a piece of tissue paper that had been wrapped around something delicate. For pressed flowers lay inside, their colors faded but still recognizable. 2 roses, deep red turned to burgundy with age, and 2 smaller flowers he thought might be forget-me-nots, their blue petals now pale as winter sky. The date on the letter made Henry pause. November 1987. The message had been traveling for over 30 years, carried by currents and tides, perhaps resting on distant beaches, perhaps floating in the deep ocean, before finally washing ashore at Beacon Point. Eleanor Morrison would be over 100 now, if she was still alive. More likely, Henry realized she had passed away years ago, never knowing that her message had found its way to someone who needed to read it. Henry sat back in his chair, the letter in his hands, and felt something shifting inside him. When had anyone last wished him moments of peace and joy? When had he last thought about the connections Eleanor wrote about, the shared sky, the shared ocean, the shared hope for kindness? His solitude, which had felt like protection for so many years, suddenly felt less like safety and more like isolation. That afternoon, instead of his usual routine of checking weather instruments and updating his log, Henry found himself thinking about Eleanor Morrison. What had her life been like in that house by the sea? Had she been widowed like him? Had she chosen solitude, or had it chosen her? What had prompted her to send a message to a stranger, to reach across the unknown with word of comfort and connection? Henry walked down to the tide line again, standing where he had found the bottle that morning. The waves rolled in with their eternal rhythm, each one carrying stories from distant places, touching shores on the other side of the world before returning to touch his feet. Eleanor was right. They were all connected by the same ocean. Her message had traveled through waters that had also carried ships past his lighthouse, had brought storms and calm weather to his rocky point, had reflected the same moon and stars he watched from his lamp room windows. That evening, Henry did something he hadn't done in years. Instead of reading after dinner, he sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and began to write. Dear Eleanor Morrison, he began, then stopped. She was almost certainly dead. Who was he writing to? He started again. To Eleanor Morrison, or to whoever might find this message, my name is Henry Whitmore, and I am the keeper of Beacon Point Light on the coast of Maine. Today I found your bottle on my beach, 33 years after you sent it into the world. Your pressed flowers are still beautiful, and your words brought me comfort I didn't know I needed. Henry paused, surprised by his own honesty. When had he admitted, even to himself, that he needed comfort? I have lived alone here for 37 years, he continued. I chose this solitude after losing my wife, Sarah, to cancer when we were both young. The Lighthouse gave me purpose and peace, and the isolation protected me from further loss. But your message made me realize that in protecting myself from loss, I may have also protected myself from connection. Henry wrote slowly, thinking about each word, writing Eleanor or to the unknown person who might someday find his response. Felt like the most honest conversation he'd had in decades. You wrote about the world being lonely sometimes, and you were right. But you were also right about connection. Your flowers traveled across an ocean to reach me. Your hope for my happiness somehow found exactly the person who needed to read it. If you are still alive, please know that your message brought beauty into the world, just as you intended. If you have passed on, please know that your kindness outlived you, carried by the sea to someone who will remember it. Henry sealed his own letter in a bottle he'd saved from his monthly supplies, adding a few pressed flowers from his own garden. Wild roses that grew in the sheltered space behind the lighthouse, and some sea lavender that bloomed purple along the rocks in late summer. The next morning at high tide, he walked down to the water's edge and sent his response out into the Atlantic. Something had changed in Henry with the writing and sending of that letter. The lighthouse and cottage, which had felt like a complete world for so many years, now felt like just one point of connection in a much larger network of human experience. Eleanor's message had reminded him that even in isolation, he was part of the human story. Over the following weeks, Henry found himself paying attention to things he'd been unconsciously ignoring for years. The fishing boats on the horizon weren't just objects to note his log. They carried real people, living their own lives, facing their own challenges and joys. The supply boat captain, who had been delivering Henry's provisions for 15 years, wasn't just an efficient provider of necessities. His name was Captain Pete Morrison. Morrison, like Eleanor, Henry noticed, and he had grown children who lived in coastal towns up and down New England. He had stories about storms weathered and beautiful sunrises witnessed from the deck of his boat. Henry began to engage more in their brief monthly conversations. Instead of just confirming his supply list and checking the weather forecast, he asked about Pete's family, his experiences on the water, his observations about how the coastline had changed over the years. Pete seemed pleased by the attention, and their exchanges grew longer and more substantive. "You seem different lately, Henry," Pete observed during one visit. "More present, I guess. Not that you were unfriendly before, just more reserved." Henry told him about finding Eleanor's message, about the way it had made him think about connection and isolation. Pete listened with interest, nodding as Henry described the realization that his protective solitude had perhaps become too complete. "My grandmother used to send messages in bottles," Pete said. "Used to drive my grandfather crazy. He said she was littering the ocean, but she always said the ocean was meant to carry messages, that the tides were how the world talked to itself." Maybe she was right. "Your grandmother," Henry said, remembering the name on Eleanor's letter. What was her name? Eleanor Morrison. She lived up the coast in Blue Harbor until she died about 20 years ago. Had a little house right on the water. Spent her last years gardening and watching the sea. Pete paused, looking at Henry with sudden interest. "Wait, you don't think..." Henry went inside and returned with Eleanor's letter, handling it carefully as he showed it to Pete. Pete read it twice, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement to something that looked like reverence. "This is her handwriting," he said softly. "And these flowers..." She had roses like this in her garden. "I remember visiting her when I was a kid, and she always had flowers pressed between the pages of her books." He looked up at Henry. "You found my grandmother's message." The coincidence seemed too remarkable to be random. Eleanor's message had traveled for 33 years before washing up on the beach tended by someone who would appreciate it. And now that person turned out to be connected, however distantly, to the man who delivered his supplies. She would have loved this, Pete continued. She always believed that things happen for reasons, that the ocean carried more than just water and fish. She used to say it carried intentions, hopes, dreams, all the things people sent out into the world looking for somewhere to land. Pete began visiting more often, sometimes just for conversation rather than deliveries. He brought stories about his grandmother, photographs of her house and garden, tales of the other messages she had sent over the years. Some had been found and responded to. He told Henry. Eleanor had received a few letters from strangers who had discovered her bottles on beaches in Nova Scotia, Ireland. Even once in the Caribbean after a hurricane. She never expected responses, Pete explained. She just wanted to send good intentions out into the world. But when letters came back, she treasured them. She had a whole box of correspondence with people she never met but felt connected through the ocean. Henry found himself looking forward to Pete's visits with an anticipation he hadn't felt about human contact in decades. Their conversations ranged over topics he'd almost forgotten he had opinions about: books, politics, philosophy, the changes they both witnessed in coastal communities over the years. Pete was intelligent and thoughtful, with the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of working on the water. Through Pete, Henry began to feel connected not just to Eleanor's memory, but to a wider community of people who lived and worked along the coast. Pete introduced him, through stories, to other lighthouse keepers, fishing captains, marine biologists, Coast Guard personnel, people whose lives intersected with the sea in different ways, but who shared a common understanding of its moods and meanings. One day, Pete arrived with an unexpected suggestion. "There's a gathering next month," he said. "Lighthouse keepers and former keepers from all along the New England coast. They meet every few years to share stories, compare notes, just connect with people who understand the work. I think you'd enjoy it." Henry's first instinct was to decline. He hadn't left Beacon Point for anything other than necessary trips to town in over a decade. The thought of being in a room full of strangers, even strangers who shared his profession, made him anxious. But then he thought about Eleanor's letter, about her words regarding connection, and the shared hope for kindness. What would she think of him turning down an opportunity to meet people who might understand his experience, who might have their own stories of solitude and purpose? "Where is it?" he asked. "Portland. Just a day trip. If you wanted, I could drive you up and back." Henry surprised himself by saying yes. The Lighthouse Keepers Gathering was held in a community center near Portland's working waterfront. About 30 people attended, current keepers, retirees, a few family members, and several people who worked in lighthouse preservation. Henry felt nervous as he walked into the room, but the anxiety began to fade as soon as he started talking with the other attendees. These were people who understood the rhythm of his days, the weight of responsibility he carried, the particular kind of satisfaction that came from maintaining something essential and enduring. They had stories about storms weathered, ships guided safely to harbor, wildlife observed from their towers, the meditative quality of routine maintenance performed in beautiful, isolated places. Henry found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing observations about weather patterns, changes in shipping traffic, the behaviors of seabirds that nested near his lighthouse. He listened to stories from keepers of lights on remote islands, automated stations that required different kinds of attention, historical lighthouses that had been converted to museums but still maintained active beacons. "The work changes you," said Martha, a retired keeper who attended a light in Nova Scotia for 25 years. All that time watching the horizon, being responsible for other people's safety, living at the edge of the continent where the known world meets the unknown ocean. You develop a different relationship with time, with solitude, with the natural world. Henry nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "I've been at Beacon Point for 37 years, he said. "Sometimes I feel like I've become part of the landscape, like the lighthouse and I are one structure." "That's not necessarily a bad thing," said Robert, who kept a light on an island off the coast of Massachusetts. "But it's good to remember that we're also part of the human landscape. We're solitary, but we're not meant to be completely isolated." The conversation reminded Henry of Eleanor's letter, of her insight about connection across distance. He told the group about finding the message in the bottle, about discovering that it had been sent by Pete's grandmother, about how it had changed his perspective on his own solitude. "Messages in bottles have always been part of lighthouse culture," Martha said. "Ships in distress used to send them when they couldn't reach shore. But people sent other kinds of messages too. Love letters, final thoughts, hopes for the future. The ocean has always carried human stories." As the gathering wound down, Henry exchanged contact information with several of the other keepers. For the first time in decades, he had a sense of belonging to a community, even if it was a scattered community of people who lived alone in remote places. On the drive back to Beacon Point, Pete asked how Henry had enjoyed the day. "More than I expected," Henry admitted. "I've forgotten what it felt like to be understood without having to explain myself." "Grandma would have said that was the ocean's gift to you," Pete replied. "Her message didn't just wash up on your beach by accident. It brought you exactly what you needed when you needed it." That evening, Henry climbed to the lamp room to begin his nightly routine of lighting the beacon. As he switched on the great light and watched it begin its steady rotation, he thought about the other lighthouses along the coast, each one tended by someone who shared a commitment to guiding travelers safely through the darkness. He was still alone at Beacon Point, still responsible for maintaining the light that warned ships away from the hidden rocks. But his solitude no longer felt like isolation. It felt like a chosen position in a network of connection, a deliberate placement that allowed him to serve something larger than himself while remaining true to his need for quiet and contemplation. Over the following months, Henry began corresponding with several of the lighthouse keepers he'd met. Their letters arrived with Pete's monthly deliveries, bringing news from other coastal outposts, observations about weather and wildlife, philosophical reflections on the nature of their shared work. Henry found himself looking forward to these exchanges, to the sense of being part of an extended conversation about life at the edge of the continent. He also began keeping a different kind of log. In addition to his official records of weather, shipping traffic, and maintenance activities, Henry started writing more personal observations about the daily life of Beacon Point. He described the way morning light moved across the water, the behaviors of the seal colony that had established itself on the rocks to the south, the subtle changes in the landscape that marked the passage of seasons. Sometimes he included these observations in his letters to other keepers. Sometimes he folded them into bottles and sent them out to sea, following Eleanor's example of sending good intentions into the world without expecting anything in return. One morning in late September, almost a year after finding Eleanor's message, Henry discovered another bottle on his beach. This one was newer, the glass clear and unweathered. Inside was a letter from a young woman named Sarah, the same name as his deceased wife, Henry noted, who lived in a coastal town in Ireland. "I found your message 3 months ago," she wrote, "washed up on the beach near my village after a storm. Your pressed flowers were still beautiful, and your words about connection across the ocean made me think about my own grandmother, who used to tell me that the sea connects all the coastlines of the world. I am sending this response back into the Atlantic, hoping it finds its way to you or to someone else who needs to know that their message was received with gratitude." Henry smiled as he read Sarah's letter, thinking about the chain of connection that had begun with Eleanor's original message. Her bottle had reached him, inspiring him to send his own message, which had reached Sarah, who had now sent another message back into the vast network of ocean currents and human hope. That afternoon, Henry walked down to the tide line and sent Sarah's bottle back out to sea, along with a new message of his own. He no longer wondered who might find his words or where they might travel. Eleanor had been right. The act of sending hope into the world was its own reward, regardless of the destination. As autumn progressed toward winter, Henry's routine remained largely the same. He maintained the lighthouse, monitored the weather, kept his logs, tended his small garden in preparation for the cold months ahead. But his relationship with solitude had fundamentally changed. He was still alone, but he no longer felt lonely. He was still isolated geographically, but he felt connected to a community that spanned oceans and decades. Pete's visits continued, bringing supplies and conversation. The correspondence with other lighthouse keepers deepened, creating friendships based on shared understanding and mutual respect. Occasionally, Henry received responses to the messages he sent in bottles, brief notes from strangers who had found his words on distant beaches and wanted to send acknowledgement back across the water. Winter brought its own rhythm to Beacon Point. The storms were fiercer, the nights longer, the work of maintaining the lighthouse more challenging. But Henry faced a harsh season with a different spirit than he had in previous years. He was no longer just enduring winter solitude. He was choosing it, embracing it as part of the larger pattern of his life. On the anniversary of finding Eleanor's message, Henry prepared a special bottle. Inside, he placed a long letter describing the year that had followed his discovery of her words. He wrote about meeting Pete, learning that Eleanor was his grandmother, attending the Lighthouse Keepers gathering, beginning correspondence with other solitary guardians of coastal beacons. He included pressed flowers from his own garden and a small piece of sea glass that had been polished smooth by decades of wave action. "Your message changed my life," he wrote to Eleanor, "not by making me less alone, but by helping me understand that being alone and being isolated are different things. I am still the solitary keeper Beacon Point Light, but I am no longer cut off from the human current that flows around and through all of us. You taught me that solitude can be a gift rather than a burden, a chosen position rather than imposed exile. Thank you for sending your hope into the ocean, and for trusting that it would find someone who needed to receive it." Henry sealed the bottle carefully and walked down to the water's edge as the sun set behind him. The lighthouse beacon had just begun its nightly rotation, sending its warning light across the darkening sea. Ships on the horizon would navigate safely through the night because of the light Henry maintained. Just as he learned to navigate his own solitude because of the light Eleanor had sent across the years. He released the bottle into the outgoing tide and watched it bob away into the darkness, carrying his gratitude and his own message of hope to whoever might find it on some distant shore. The ocean accepted his offering with the same indifference and grace it had shown Eleanor's message 34 years earlier, carrying human words and intentions along with its cargo of salt and seaweed and stories. Henry climbed back up to the lighthouse, checked the beacon one final time, and settled into his reading chair with a book and a cup of tea. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sense of salt and autumn, the sound of waves against rocks, the eternal conversation between land and sea. He was alone at Beacon Point, as he had been for 37 years. But he was no longer lonely. Eleanor Morrison's message had taught him the difference, and in learning that difference, Henry had discovered that the most profound connections often came not from constant companionship, but from a knowledge that somewhere across the vast waters, other people were sending out their own signals of hope, their own beacons of kindness, their own messages in bottles, trusting that the ocean would carry them to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. The lighthouse beam swept across the water in its steady rhythm, a reliable signal in the darkness, calling ships safely home. Henry watched its light move across the waves and thought about all the other lights along the coast, all the other keepers tending their beacons, all the messages traveling through the darkness toward unknown destinations and unexpected discoveries. In the morning, he would clean the lens, check the weather, maintain his logs, walk the tide line to see what the ocean had brought to his shore. The routine would continue, but it would no longer feel like mere repetition. It would feel like participation in the larger story of connection and hope that flowed like an invisible current beneath all the visible currents of the sea. Henry opened his book and began to read, the lighthouse beam sweeping steadily overhead, carrying its light across the water to anyone who might need guidance through the darkness, just as Eleanor's message had carried light across the years to someone who had forgotten he was looking for it, until the moment he found it waiting for him on the sand, like a gift from the ocean itself.